Hello dear friends and my dear students, Assalamu alaikum. Friends, you know that we are discussing about the epithelial tissues. So in the previous lecture we have discussed about the features of the apical surface of the epithelial tissue, and the lecture before that we discussed about the features in the basal surface and the lateral surface of the epithelial tissues. So these were the structures of the epithelial tissues, right? Then let me relate my previous lectures here, friends, that what we have up to now, what we have discussed about epithelial tissues. Please, I'm writing this because I want you guys to please go and watch these lectures to have a clear concept of the epithelial tissues. So in the first lecture I have introduced the tissues, right? What are the tissues? So we know that in our body we have four types of the tissues: the epithelial tissue, right? Epithelial, the connective tissue, the muscular tissue, and the nervous tissue we have in our body. I have just introduced them. Then we started explaining the epithelia, right, in detail. So in the lecture about epithelia, first was about its introduction, right? What is epithelial tissue? Then about its locations, I have discussed in which areas of the body different types of epithelial tissues are present. Then we discussed about the classification of epithelial tissues. We classified epithelial tissues, right? Then we discussed about the basal surface, right, of the epithelial tissue. What are the structure here? I mean the basal lamina or basement membrane, about that I have discussed. Then we discussed about the lateral surfaces of the epithelial tissues, that what are in the lateral surfaces, and then we discussed what are the structures in the apical surfaces of the epithelial tissues. So we have came up to here. So this was all about the epithelial tissue. Now the remaining thing about epithelia is that we should know about some of its functions, right? So right now in this lecture I will be focusing on the functions of epithelial tissue, so that it will help us to complete the lectures regarding the epithelial tissue. So let's go for the functions of epithelial tissue, that what does this tissue performs in our body. So let us discuss about the functions of epithelia, right? Let me write here functions of epithelial tissue, or we can say functions of epithelia, right? Quite simple. Let us know about some important functions of epithelial tissue, that what does these tissues perform in our body. So the first function that is very important is the protective function, protection, and I will give you, for each function I will be giving examples, right? So the first function is protection. So how protection? Look carefully. If here is a person standing, right, here is our friend, and you know, all of his body is covered with a very protective and immunized layer that is called the skin. So if you want to know that your skin is made up of what, so that is the superficial layer of the skin is made up of skin. So your skin is surrounding your body, right, and the skin is a waterproof organ. Nothing can go inside and nothing can come outside from the skin. That's why we say that if you want to see your skin is made up of how many layers, so our skin is made up of two layers. There are two important layers of the skin. So the first layer is called the epidermis, and the second layer is called the dermis, like this, right? So what is this layer? This is called the epidermis layer, and this epidermis layer, you know, it is a stratified, keratinized, squamous epithelial tissue. So our skin is quite important for the protection of our body, and you know, this superficial layer of the skin, this upper layer of the skin is epithelial tissue, epithelial tissue, right? So here below this epithelial tissue there is the connective tissue layer, and this connective tissue layer we have connective tissues, so we are not going to discuss that. We just want to see that how this epithelia is performing its protective function. So look carefully, your epithelia, the superficial layer of the skin is covering the lower parts of your body or the lower layers of the skin, so that nothing can go inside and nothing can come outside. So this epithelial layer, which is stratified, right, stratified, keratinized squamous epithelial tissue, this is protective in function. It is performing its protective function for our body. It is protecting us. The next important function that this tissue performs is the synthesis function. This tissue in our body synthesizes different substances and different chemicals. And how? Let us know. First, look carefully. In our body we have glands, right? And there are exocrine glands, and then there are endocrine glands. Clear, friends? So these endocrine glands and exocrine glands, look carefully, exocrine glands synthesize enzymes, right? In a simple way I am telling you, enzymes, and endocrine glands are synthesizing hormones, chemical messengers which are called hormones. So look carefully, in these glands, right, in these glands, for example, if this is an exocrine gland, let me give you an example here. This is an exocrine gland and it has a special duct, right? Okay, let's remove that. So in this exocrine gland there are cells, and these cells are epithelial cells, and these cells synthesize these chemical substances which are called enzymes and then secrete them. So we say that these glands, which are called exocrine glands, these glands are synthesizing enzymes. So in exocrine glands there are epithelial tissues, and these epithelial tissues perform the function of synthesis. Then for endocrine glands, for example, this is an endocrine gland and these are its cells. Quite simple, these are the cells of the endocrine gland. Now what happens around this endocrine gland? You know, there are blood vessels, right, arteries or veins or anything. So whenever they secrete, they synthesize their chemicals, right, and keep them in a secret environment which is called the lumen of the gland. So whenever they are needed, they are taken from the lumen and are poured into the blood. So when directly pour their secretions into the blood, these are called endocrine glands. So in endocrine glands also there are epithelial cells, and these epithelial cells make hormones. So we say that these tissues are responsible for protection, these tissues are responsible for synthesis of different substances in our body. And the next function of them is the secretory function. Look, whenever they secretory function, you know, whenever they synthesize something, look, from here we will clear this function also. Whenever they synthesize something here in the cells and they keep in secret environment, from there they secrete them, right? So this process, when a gland loses its contents into some area, when a gland sends its contents to some special area, this is called secretion. So our epithelial tissue performs also secretory function. For example, you know, in your mouth saliva is secreted, in your nose mucus is secreted, in respiratory tract mucus is secreted, in GIT mucus is secreted, enzymes are secreted, hormones are secreted, right? So all these functions are performed by these epithelial tissues. So epithelial tissues perform secretory function, right? So the protective function, synthesis function, secretory function. The fourth one, gaseous exchange. They help in gaseous exchange. How? Look, I will give you example for each. In gaseous exchange, look carefully. In your lungs, right, in our lungs we have millions of alveoli, right? For example, this is alveoli, right, and around this alveolus there are blood vessels, we know well, and these blood vessels, what do? They bring carbon dioxide, right, and they take back oxygen. So look carefully, these walls of this alveolus are made up of squamous cells, and these squamous cells are what? These are epithelial cells, right? Now look carefully. Whenever we breathe in, oxygen comes into the alveolus. From these alveolus, these cells will take this oxygen and will give it to the blood, and from the blood these cells will take the carbon dioxide and give it outside, right? So they help in exchange of gases. Why? Because here are the epithelial cells. Please focus here. Here are the epithelial cells, and these epithelial cells here perform the function of gaseous exchange, right? So we say they perform protective function. One example for each, please. The skin is a protective organ. The superficial layer of the skin, which is called stratified keratinized squamous epithelial tissue, it performs protection. Then synthesis function, these. Then secretory function I showed you here. And then gaseous exchange, they also help in gaseous exchange. Next important function that these epithelial tissues perform is the filtrative function, or we say filtration. How? Let us know where they perform the function of filtration. Look, in your glomerulus, right? This is the glomerulus, right? And here, you know, we have the epithelial tissues, epithelial cells. These are the epithelial cells. Now look carefully. What happens whenever efferent arterioles come and they make a bunch here, which is called glomerulus, and efferent goes again. So what happens here? Here the blood is filtered, and this is called filtration of the blood. So you know, here is the epithelial cells, and these epithelial cells help in filtration of the blood. They prevent the excretion of important substances from the blood, and they only allow those substances which are not important for the body too much, right? So they perform the function of filtration also. So here in the glomerulus, you can give example of filtrative function of the epithelial tissues. The next important function that these epithelial tissues perform is the absorption function. Absorption function. How? Look carefully. On your skin, whenever you apply an ointment or any cream or any drug which is applied topically, what happens? This superficial layer of the skin will take that drug, will absorb that drug. So isn't it absorptive function? Yes. The next function, the next example for absorption is that in our GIT, right, we have GIT, and in the inner mucosa of the GIT we have these epithelial cells, epithelial tissues. Now whenever we eat different substances, right, these are the epithelial cells. Quite simple. When we eat substances, these substances are digested, and when these digested substances come here to the lumen of the GIT, what is going to be done? These cells, which are epithelial cells, they will absorb all those substances, and what will they do? They will assimilate them, and whenever they will assimilate them, these substances will be given to the veins and then to the body, right? So this function is called the absorptive function. So look, from the lumen, the food substances are taken by these cells, and from these, inside these cells they are assimilated, and from these cells they are given to the blood. So blood takes it to all parts of the body. So we say they perform absorptive function. Very simple. Absorptive function is explained here. Absorptive function is also explained in the skin, right? The next important function that these cells perform, they help in reproduction. Reproduction. How they help in reproduction? The epithelial tissues help in reproduction. How? Look carefully. Inside your testes, right? If I make a simple diagram here, these, if you see here, these are your right test and left test, for example, and inside the test, you know, there are septa, and inside these septa there are the seminiferous tubules are present there. Seminiferous tubules are present there, right? We have discussed about the structure of this already. So inside this there are the seminiferous tubules, and you know, in seminiferous tubules there are epithelial cells, and they help in the production of sperm, right? So when sperm is produced, normal reproduction is performed, right? In the ovaries of the female, you know, you have cuboidal epithelial cells. So all those cells there, what do? They help in protection and nourishment of all these reproductive cells, gametes, right? So we say that epithelial cells help. Other than that, you know, there is epididymis, right? And in the lecture before that I told you that in the epididymis there are the cells which contain the stereocilia, the epithelial cells which contain the stereocilia, and these are very important right here. Then in the walls of aren't these tubes? All of them are tubes, no? So in these tubes are made up of epithelial cells, right? So they help in reproduction. Epithelial tissue also help in normal reproduction. We should remember this. The next important function for the epithelial tissues is that they perform, what is that?